Mr. President and Reverend Father. I'm delighted that this church will be preserved by you and your parishioners. And that it's begun a new phase in its life as St. Catherine Alexandria's church. June has asked me to say a few words about the family of the Reverend Featherstone Osler, who in 1839, in the hamlet of Bondhead, on the edge of the wilderness, built this church, in which he preached, and Ellen and their remarkable children worshipped for many years. My interest in the most famous son of this parsonage, Sir William Osler, goes back more than 75 years to when, as a boy, I was given a copy of the 2-volume biography by the great neurosurgeon Harvey Cushing. My family interest goes back 98 years to when my mother used this copy of Osler's textbook of medicine when she was a nursing student at the Montreal General Hospital. The magnitude of William Osler's worldwide influence is brought home as Google this week produced 288,000 references to him. There are at least 3 schools in Canada named for him, including our own in Bradford, West Gwillimbury. There are 2 major biographies, Cushing's in 1925, and the other more recently by Michael Bliss, one of Canada's finest historians and biographers, University of Toronto professor of medical history. And there are thousands of other books and essays about him. There are active Osler societies to this day in many countries. Just a few are the American Osler Society, with branches all over the continent, the Osler Club of London, England, the Osler Society of McGill University. There are internet websites and medical student unions named for him at Oxford University, in Singapore, in India, and in countries all around the world. There is the new regional hospital, the William Osler Health Centre in Brampton, and this Canadian Osler postage stamp was from the days when 6 cents would get your mailed. And even the U.S. Navy had a ship, the Sir William Osler, in World War II. Visitors from abroad come to Bondhead to visit this church, the Osler Church. Recently, Lord John Walton, who was former Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford and President of the Royal College of Physicians, drove to Bondhead to see the church. And he has written a strong letter urging its preservation, as has the President of the Toronto Medical History Society. Featherstone Osler's first career was in the Royal Navy, where as an officer at sea for many years, he endured shipwrecks and battles with Brazilian pirates. At age 28, he began a new career in the church, doing well in his 3 years at Cambridge. The Reverend Featherstone Osler's father, evidently a practical man, advised his son, in taking a wife, to find one with a mind and a pocket. They must not be separated. Ellen Picton, also from Cornwall, married Featherstone, and they set off in 1837 for Upper Canada under the auspices of a missionary society, arriving in Bondhead on the day that Victoria was crowned queen. Bondhead was described as a little village on the edge of the Canadian wilderness, surrounded by forest, where bears and wolves roamed. The house that the young couple was given was no more than a hut. In Ellen's words, a shed, a clearing in the woods, one room upstairs and one down, in which the cattle had sheltered. It is scarcely possible to move without being shod in dung and dirt. In the winter, they had to survive with the floor at times covered with snow blown through the chinks in the walls. Milk, kept even within a yard of the fire, was frozen hard in the morning, and the cabin was swarming with vermin. The Reverend Featherstone complained that his flock were reluctant to give up their blasphemy and their whiskey. To see his parishioners, he rode 24 miles on horseback. I have passed through mud up to the horse's belly and walked through swamps with the horse stepping from one log to another. Perhaps the big swamp south of Cookstown. At the same time, he was building a church and a parsonage, starting schools and a library. He was said to have introduced books to their bookless lives. And the cheerful and patient Ellen, perhaps the most remarkable of all this family, taught needlework and sewing and morals while raising 9 children. She lived to celebrate her 100th birthday.
Oh, wow.
Out of this wilderness parsonage and church came a son described as the best known and most beloved physician in the world. Why is William Osler so famous? Well, above all, he was a great teacher. He revolutionized medical education. As the first professor of medicine at the new Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, he brought medical students to the bedside, where they learned directly from the examination of patients. Until then, students had spent most of their time in lectures. He wrote single-handed this massive textbook of medicine. There were no co-authors. Translated into German, French, Spanish, and Chinese, and used by hundreds of thousands of students in medical schools around the world. He lived at a time in the late 1800s and the early 1900s when the new scientific knowledge of bacteriology and biochemistry and physiology was exploding. And he taught students to make use of it. But as well as a scientist, he was a philosopher who wrote more than 1,500 books, essays, and addresses, in which he stressed to students that their behavior, kindness, and warmth must match their scientific skills. He taught this by the example of his own life, and it is probably this as much as anything else which made him a great man. In the United States, and as professor of medicine at Oxford, his influence was felt in high places. He persuaded John D. Rockefeller to start the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which has had a profound influence on world health. Lord Strathcona of Montreal found his friendship to be expensive, as he was always getting hit by Osler for donations to research. The Prince of Wales was his patient. He had a lifelong interest in history, spending most of his money and some of his brother Edmund's on old and rare books, leaving a magnificent library to McGill. Michael Bliss told me that when he began his years of research for his Osler biography, he expected to find the usual flaws of great men. He could not find them, and had to conclude that Osler was a genuinely good man. But he was not perfect. He was given to practical jokes from an early age. The students at our Osler school might be interested to know that their patron was expelled from school. Or something related to a flock of geese in the headmaster's office. Even as a famous professor, he sent fictitious and ribald case reports to medical journals under an assumed name, which more than one innocent editor published. And that is only William. The Reverend Featherstone and Ellen had another son who was knighted. 2 knights of the realm and one modest family in a remote country parsonage is remarkable. Sir Edmund Osler, founder and president of the Dominion Bank, an early trustee of the Hospital for Sick Children and the Toronto General Hospital and the Royal Ontario Museum, was a member of Parliament for 21 years and one of the wealthiest men in Canada. A third son, Britain, was the most respected lawyer of his day, starting what is now the huge law firm of Osler, Hoskin, Harcourt. And yet a fourth son, Mr. Justice Featherstone Osler, Judge of the Appeal Court of Ontario, turned down a seat on the Supreme Court of Canada that was offered to him by John A. Macdonald. And so this St. Catherine's Church in Bondhead, built in by and preached in by the Reverend Featherstone Osler and home to his astonishing family, is a piece of Canadian history of interest around the world. For reference, I would commend to you the online Dictionary of Canadian Biography, article by Charles Rowland of McMaster, of course Michael Bliss's biography, and Lions in the Way, in which Sir Edmund Osler's granddaughter gives a vivid description of early life in Bondhead, and this copy of which I am glad to give to Father Dachuk with my best wishes for the future of this church.
Thank you very much. I'm not really sure what I should tell you today, because I was asked to speak about many different things, about my own journey to the priesthood and about our parish's journey to purchasing this facility and how we came to be here. And all of that I suppose takes a lot of time and a lot of, I don't know how much interest you have in me, because I'm a stranger to you. But I was born in New York City in 1945, just as the war was ending. And my father named me Conrad because he was a great fan of Joseph Conrad, whom you may have heard of. He was an author. And Joseph Conrad was an immigrant from Poland to England, and his name was Conrad in Polish. And he wrote Tales of the Sea, and he became such an expert in the English language, which was quite unusual, because English, as you may know from immigrants, is a very difficult language to learn, and it's an impossible language to spell. But Joseph Conrad mastered all of that, and he wrote Tales of the Sea. And my father, for some reason, I really don't know why, but he loved the sea. He loved Tales of the Sea, and he was something of an artist too, and he used to like to draw little pencil sketches of these great ships, you know, the old sailing ships that used to ply the ocean. My dad was an attorney. He was the son of immigrants. Our family comes from what is now Western Ukraine. They came to the United States in the late 1800s, and they came from that area. It was at that time known as Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary was a very unusual kind of a kingdom. It fell after the First World War and was dismembered. But very often people that came from Austria-Hungary liked Austria-Hungary very, very much. Austria-Hungary included not only Austria-Hungary, but also Czechoslovakia, Western Ukraine, large parts of Poland and Italy, and Serbia, and various other places such as that. My grandmother, my mother's mother, loved the emperor very much. It was the Emperor Franz Josef, And I remember when I was small, there was a portrait of the emperor in her living room. So I don't know if that may have sparked my own interest in history, because I've always been something of a history buff too. I enjoy history very, very much. We grew up in I suppose, a typical kind of a situation in New York in those days. Just about everybody in New York City was the children or the grandchildren of immigrants, and we grew up just not so much speaking about multiculturalism, but living a kind of multicultural life. Our closest neighbors on one side were Jewish, and I remember they had only one daughter, and when the Passover occurred, it's the custom in Jewish homes for the youngest son to ask the father, "Why is this night different from others?" And they recite the Passover history. But this family didn't have a son, so I was the stand-in son. So I got to ask the questions, why is this night different from others? And we would hear my father was a wandering Aramean, and the whole story of the Exodus was told. And it was some of these things I haven't remembered in so long.
Yeah, this is a good place.
It's hard to realize that so much time has gone by, and we wonder sometimes what has happened to that time. So that when we consider a church such as this one, which is now 175 years old this year, I understand it was originally constructed in 1835, and it was moved here from another place, but its original construction was in that age and that year. So the church is 175 years old now, and part of our night today is that we will go on a tour of the church, and you'll see that after all those years the church is a little bit tired, in the sense that it's beginning to show its age, I suppose, as all of us do after a while. The church is in need of repair, and when we speak of Sir William Osler, I like to think that he would still think of this as his church. That even though it is no longer an Anglican church, it is now a Catholic church, but nevertheless, I think a good deal of the goodness of Sir William Osler, which, as Neil said, was part of the reason for his greatness as a human being, his kindness and his warmth, I'm sure came from his upbringing. His father was an Anglican minister, and I'm sure that the principles of Christianity, those very homey principles of the gospel, of love for one another, giving the neighbor, the stranger, a cup of water, all those things I'm sure were of great influence in his life. And as a result, I think a good deal of his medical practice is very much of the type of what so many great Christian physicians have exemplified. I think of Dr. Albert Schweitzer and others who were not only physicians, who cared not only for the body, but had a great appreciation of what was beyond the body as well. And so I think Sir William Osler's emphasis on kindness and warmth, and not being at a distance from the patients, but actually bringing his students around to see the sick, to be able to not only see them, but to speak to them, and to learn from their real life situations as they were lying there in bed before them, so that the idea of medicine would not be an abstract to them, but would be a real thing incarnate in people who were truly suffering, and whom as physicians they were called upon to serve and to relieve. And I think a lot of that came from his upbringing here in this church, from his father, and I think that's reflected in his whole family. His brother Edmund, as I was reading some of the articles that are in here, evidently was not only the wealthiest man in Canada, but also a very generous man in Canada, perhaps one of the most generous in Canada. So it was no surprise that people that he knew often felt that they could come to him and ask for assistance and help in founding so many wonderful institutions and schools of learning that are still around to this very day. So we have Sir William Osler, and Neil was mentioning this book that his mom learned from as a nurse, and the reason why he gave the parish this book here is because he asked me if we would be interested in beginning a little collection of Sir William Osler's books and memorabilia connected with him, and I said, oh, we would most certainly be very happy to do that. And I brought him right into the church to show him my beginning collection of Osler literature. And I happen to have a copy of this book as well, but mine is 3 years older. So I might be able to say that our association with Sir William Osler goes back maybe 101 years, so now maybe 98 years. We are very honored to have been able to purchase this building. I don't think it's so much that we purchased it, but I think the good Lord directed us here, and the good Lord provided the means and the opportunity for that to occur. A good deal of our purchase of this building was the result of the hard work of Maria Chidroni, who is here with us today. And Maria Chidroni has been much more than my right hand. Maria adopted me several months ago because of I think a kind of miraculous chain of events. So we were able to become acquainted with each other, and Maria's energy led us eventually to the purchase of this church. We became aware that the church was no longer in use, and we approached the diocesan authorities. There was Bishop George Elliott, who is the vicar bishop for this area, whose office is in King City, and he told us that the church had been closed as a parish. It had been amalgamated with the Tottenham parish, and that it was most likely that this facility was going to be sold. So we immediately registered our interest in the church, and I mentioned to him that in England, when Ukrainians first began to immigrate to England after the Second World War, there was a very small population of people from Eastern Europe and England. But after the Second World War, a number of Ukrainians began to settle there for very strange reasons. The Western world was not really all that, at the time, was not all that knowledgeable as to what communism was and what communism was trying to achieve. And so after the First World War, there were a number of prisoners of war that were going to be sent back to Russia, back to the new Soviet Union. And many of these soldiers were of Russian background, and they were supporters of the Tsar. So they were known as White Russians in the White Russian army that fought against the communists. And the British government wanted to repatriate them to Russia, and some of these people began to commit suicide in the prisoner of war camps. And finally it woke the English up, who are not actually the best in their foreign policy. We look at some of the things around the world that England created. We wonder how could people have done that, but it's a different world now than it was then. And so they stopped repatriating displaced persons to the Soviet Union. So as a result of that, many Russians were able to settle in Great Britain, and many Ukrainians were as well. And with the Ukrainians, very, very important was the church. When Ukrainian immigrants first came to Pennsylvania in 1886, they immigrated from Austria-Hungary, from Western Ukraine, because there was great poverty there. There was very little chance to make a future, and as many immigrants, people from Europe, were very enterprising, and all they needed was something of an opportunity. So they came to Pennsylvania, and they worked hard in the mines. And they wrote to Cardinal Sembratovich in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, who was the chief hierarch, and they said to him, "We think of you as our father, and here we have all the opportunity we need, but what we lack is God, because we have no church." So they asked for a priest to be sent. So he sent them a priest to Pennsylvania, and eventually other priests came and other communities were formed, and it was very important for people to have a church. The church where they would be able to worship God, where they were able to have God in their midst, where they would be able to know one another, where they would be able to develop their religious life as well as their cultural and their sectoral life also around the church. And so when Ukrainians first started coming to Canada, it was a strange situation because this country was primarily then of British background, and it was not always very welcoming of immigrants. I remember one family, their name was Vasilishin, but their name was changed. They changed their name because it was very difficult to get a job with a name like Vasilishin, so they became Washington. And I'm sure you all have stories that you can tell. But anyway, in the midst of that, there were many bright spots, and I think Sir William Osler is definitely one of those bright spots, because I think he was a very atypical Britisher. He was of British background, but I'm sure his medical history and his medical his drive to help and to serve people moved him so much beyond the prejudices of the old world, so that I'm sure in his developing new methods of diagnosis and new methods of medical practice, his concern was primarily to serve his brother. And so when it was that Cain asked God, because we remember in the Old Testament God asks Cain, he says, "Where is your brother Abel?" And God asked the question on purpose because he knew that Cain had murdered Abel. And so Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper? How would I know where he is?" And of course the answer is, yes, you are. And that's what Sir William Osler, I think, would have answered as well. So I think whenever he came across any kind of sickness or suffering, he was an example, not only to those of his own age, but I think, as Neil mentioned, so much of his famousness today is because of that concern that he had for other people. And in our own day and age, it's perhaps something of a saying to say that respect is something nowadays that we are not entitled to, but respect is something that we earn. And I think in a good way, in a very large measure, he shows exactly what that means through his own concern for others. So we were very happy to purchase this church. I think the good Lord led us here because we were a small congregation. The parish was founded in Newmarket, but as it happens, most of our parishioners now live in Bradford. And so when we learned that the parish here had closed, and we had gone to visit Bishop Elliot and learned that the church was going to be put up for sale, it was a whole journey from then that had its ups and downs, and had its... one day we would be very, very happy because everything seemed to be going exactly as we wanted, and the next week, as happy as we were the week before, that's how sad we were in that week, because there were all sorts of other people that were beginning to bid against us in the purchase of this facility. So I think it was the good Lord who eventually, I remember a prayer I uttered, and it was a selfish prayer. I said to the good Lord, well, if somehow you would gently nudge all the others out of the way. Well, he did, he listened. And eventually all the others were gently nudged out of the way, and after all the difficulties that the last difficulty to meet was, of course, to raise the funds to purchase the church, and we were able to do that through the generosity of a family in the United States who extended to us a loan for a considerable amount of money for 5 years without interest.
Oh, wow.
And so we now have to engage in a, I just wish Sir Edmund were still alive. Well, here's a good cause, but anyway, I think I might get in touch with Neil and ask him for the addresses for many of those institutions that you mentioned, the descendants of the Oslers that are still around, the law firm and perhaps others, and ask if they might be of some assistance to us. As we walk around the building today, you will notice that as I say, that the building is beginning to show its age. And one of the things that is the worst in showing its age is the towers, the bell tower. And that is the signature, I think, of this church in this area. From all around this area, you can see that tower, and that tower has been there for all these years. Well, unfortunately, the tower is in danger of collapsing because the bricks are loose, and the fabric of the building has not been maintained for quite some time. So as a result, in the wintertime, the water gets in between the bricks and it expands, and then the bricks are falling, and so there's great danger that the top of the tower will collapse. So we're not able to ring the bell, although for our first Mass, which was held here on the 17th of August, I would dearly have loved to ring the bell to call the people in the area to church, and we couldn't. But I do have a big hand bell that we so I don't know what else I can tell you about either the church or about myself, other than to say it's very nice that you were able to have your meeting here today. I think it's a nice, just this past Sunday for us was New Year's Day. The church New Year's begins in September, which is a nice time to begin a new year because so many things begin. It's sort of like the beginning of school, the beginning of so many other things, and so with the beginning of the fall time, we just get out of rest mode or relax mode of the summer, we get into work mode of the autumn. So we celebrated the new year this past Sunday, and it's not only a new year ahead of us in this parish, but a whole several years ahead. I think this will be for us a perfect home, and we will certainly not forget Sir William Osler. I think his presence is still very, very, very strongly felt here. Not only because of all the artifacts that are still here. As we were cleaning the church, there's a cubbyhole under the stairs here, and we found many, many old things that had been stored away there from the time of the Second World War, and there's one thing for King and Country, and there's a whole thing there, and just very nice things. And somebody thought, well, maybe we should just throw these things out. I was rather horrified because anything that's more than 20 years old, I couldn't possibly throw out. Yeah. So if you were to come to my house to Newmarket, you would wonder, how does this person ever walk around in here? But all those things we will refurbish and eventually place on the walls of this hall. Yesterday I was at the hospital. I was visiting a parishioner of mine who was a rather odd woman, a very nice woman, a woman that has had a very difficult life. She had never been married. She cared for her parents, and her parents came from the extreme western part of Western Ukraine in Europe, and they came after the Second World War, and they settled here on the Holland Marsh. And she is also a historian and loves history. So I went to anoint her at the hospital yesterday to bring a communion, and I spent about 2 hours with her. And she was able to, on August the 17th, to come into our first Mass here. And she said, Father, I would really like to ask you something. And I said, well, anything, what would you like? So she said, if I were to make a donation to the parish, could you use it in some way? I would like it to be used in some way for the restoration of the building. Now this is a woman who has absolutely no contact with the Anglican Church or with Sir William Osler, other than the fact that she loves the fact that this is a historical place, and for that it is special to her. So she has no children, and whatever donation she makes, she said she would like for the maintenance of the fabric. So I said, well, we would really, Dorothy, be able to use that for the repair of the tower. And she thought that was wonderful because she hopes to be here. She has cancer now, but she hopes to be here, please God, to be the first one to pull the rope, to ring the bell. So there are so many bright spots amid sometimes the sadness or the losses that we feel. There are many historical places that have not been preserved. From New York, I remember the great tragedy that many people felt when Penn Station was demolished. It was modeled on the ancient baths of Caracalla in Rome, and it was something that was a true historical monument to New York, and it was demolished to put up the new Madison Square Garden, which is a rather ugly-looking building, in no way as pleasing or as interesting or as just as wonderful as the old Penn Station was. But nevertheless, even in the midst of that, there are perhaps smaller victories, but all of those smaller victories put together. And the fact that so many of you belong to this historical society, I think is just a wonderful, wonderful testimony to the fact that many people in our little area here of Tecumseh and Bradford, West Gwillimbury, and Bond Head, we have to put Bond Head in there as well, are interested in historical things. So I want to welcome you to St. Catherine's Church, to the old Trinity Anglican Church, to the church where Sir William Osler grew up and was born. And I just hope that this will be a wonderful meeting for you and a wonderful beginning of a productive year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Conrad. I think we appreciate very much you sharing your life, some of your life with us, and this good feeling that we all have right now. I just hope we can just keep it and go from here, and hope that you'll be with us for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
David Chambers, if you'd like to tell us about the architecture.
What an exciting meeting.
You're right.
Very good program, Madam Chairman, Anyway, I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of the Osler celebration, of the Osler family celebration tonight, and a new chapter in the history of the Osler Church. We got a lot of information from Neil about the Osler family, and it's just amazing what these people did. It's just incredible. I mean, here we have a family of, well, they're all Canadian icons, I think, and especially the sons. To think what these 4 sons did, all coming from the same family, and they all were born, most of them were born right here in Bond Head. They had their early childhood here, right in their own backyard. And who ever hears about it? Do you hear local people talk about these people? What have we got? We've got a plaque down the street. And in fact, we should be promoting these people and capitalizing on them. And interpreting the history of Bond Head and be so proud of it. And we don't do this. This is not what I'm going to talk about tonight. But I have written town council about this. And I don't even get a reply from them. And I was most pleasant in my letter, I can assure you. So it really is somewhat of a mystery. I mean, if this community existed down in the States, can you imagine what they'd be doing?
Yeah.
Back to topic here. I'm just going to go over a little bit of history first before I get into the architecture. But the Oslers left Toronto by stage for Tecumseh on June the 19th, 1837. June the 19th, 1837. Took them all day to get here. When they came here, they found the framework of 2 churches. That's all it was the framework. One church was in West Gwillimbury, one in Tecumseh. Now the one in Tecumseh was St. John's down the 6th line. Not the one that's there today, of course. And the one in West Gwillimbury, I am not sure where it was located, but I kind of think it was probably Middletown. There was no Middletown then, but everyone knows where Middletown is. So I think that was the location of the two churches that just had a framework. So he came on the 19th and he had his first service on the 25th. The first Sunday that was here, he had his first service. And that was in St. John's. The floor was laid. There was no windows. There was no plastering done. And he, at the same day, he had a service in West Goldenberry, and that was in a barn.
Oh dear.
Now, before these churches were finished, and before this church, of course, was built, he preached in schools, in stables, barns, and houses. And he not only preached here in this community, but he traveled. He traveled down to Bolton. He went up to Penetang, Barrie. And traveling was not very good. If you should read it, and you realize what good fortune you have to be living today. Now, when they first came here, they had no lodging. So, one of the parishioners agreed to give them a very small parlor and a bedroom off that parlor. It was very small quarters, and they never had room for their luggage. They had to store their luggage in a barn 1 or 2 miles away. When they moved in their house out here, about a year later, they of course moved their luggage in. They opened luggage that had not been opened since they left England.
Oh.
That's the sort of life they had the first year they lived here. And as Neil said, they lived in hovels. In one place they had to remove the animals. And they cleaned it out a little bit. They moved in. I think that is the building you were referring to, Neil. There was several places they lived because they had to move around. And in this one particular building, the animals did not like that the Oslers moved into their house. So they stayed around the outside. They couldn't get rid of these animals. And of course the animals were animals. We all know what animals do. And so they couldn't get out their place without walking in things. So, you know, these are some of the hardships that these people endured in coming to the backwoods of Upper Canada. So, in the spring of 1838, things came to a head. And the Reverend Osler called a meeting, and he declared that unless suitable lodging was not found, they were going to move out. They had no other choice. So what they did was, they had...
There's something I forgot to mention in my own talk, and that is Maria Chadrone and I had been, for many weeks, had been looking for a place that we would, that St. Catherine's Parish would eventually be able to buy. And as we were visiting different people, we'd knock on this door, and knock on that door, and knock on another door, and someone says, well, if you're going to raise money, if you knock on a door and they tell you they're not interested, well, then leave right away. But anyway, we were knocked on one door, of people that we knew already, and that was Mickey Nanowski's. So we went to visit with Mickey, who has a very nice printing establishment, and she had printed a number of things for us without charge. And we happened to mention to Mickey, well, we were looking for a place in the summertime, because in the wintertime and through the year we had been having Mass on Sundays at Holy Trinity High School in Bradford. But in the summer months, July and August, the school is closed. So we happened to be visiting with Mickey and mentioned to her, well, do you know of any place that would be empty during the summer? And she says, well, there's the old Anglican church in Bond Head. And that's really, I suppose, what started our journey, you know, to this point where we are now. So thank you very much, Mickey. Where are you? We never know where our, you know, what our comments will lead to. And so Mickey, of course, is very much a part of the historical establishment and the whole historical atmosphere in Bradford. And we have her comment to thank that we are able to be sitting in this church today. And these pews are the most this is what every time I have Mass here, I think lawsuit. Somebody's going to sit on these pews once, slip right through. And a 6-year-old or 7-year-old crack his head and everything. So if you know anyone that wants pews.
I just want to say a few more words. I'm sure you're finding the pews very comfortable. We'll start the second half of our meeting. It'll be about an hour. This is pretty much the way the church looked inside before it was moved, I would think. I'm not sure about the windows. Well, I know the glass is not original because they weren't putting colored glass in country churches in 1840. But, I mean, the frames, too. I rather suspect that that's all new, and I rather suspect they had just regular 8x10 glass, clear glass in the windows. So they probably changed the windows.